In this lesson, we'll finish mill apart. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to create a 2D contour toolpath. Let's carry on with the file from our previous example, and now let's create all the toolpaths to finish this part. Most of these are going to be 2D contours, but we also need to drill and tap each of these holes. I'm going to leave the drilling and tapping to the end, and first I want to get started by creating a facing operation. This is something that we omitted, so I'm going to select Face, grab my facing tool, which has already been used, tool number 8, and then I'm simply going to select OK. This creates our facing operation, and I'm going to bring this up to the top so we can simply hold with the left mouse button and drag it up. If it doesn't let you, you might need to drag some of the previous operations below it, because there are certain instances where it has trouble dragging all the way to the top. So just make sure that you put the facing operation first, then our 2D adaptive, which is cutting the outside of the part, and then the 2D adaptive, which is starting to remove the material on the inside of the part. Now remember, we left stock everywhere, and right now we have a 1/4" end mill. When we're talking about creating operations, we want to keep in mind the tool that we're using, and we want to minimize those tool changes. So the first thing that I want to do is use measure, and I want to inspect the size of this bore. The diameter is 0.827, so the 1/2" bit can get in there and cut some of that geometry. If I measure the radius on this large section here, we can see that this is also large enough for me to get that 1/2" in there. This one here is getting kind of close, but the 1/2" can still go in and cut that geometry. And the small one here, this is going to be too small to get a 1/2" tool in, but the 1/4" can go in and finish those and finish this section here. We can also take the 1/4" in to finish off these holes. Since our tool library only contains a 0.201 drill, we can pre-drill and then use a 1/4" end mill to finish off those holes. So keeping this in mind, note that we've used our face mill, then we've used a 1/2" end mill and a 1/4" end mill. I want to carry on using the 1/2" end mill, so I'm going to create some new toolpaths and then make sure that they sit directly after this to minimize our tool changes. So we're going to select 2D contour. We're going to make sure that our tool is our 1/2" end mill, which is tool number 6. And then for our geometry, I'm going to select the bottom edge here. I'm not going to leave any material behind. I want to make sure that everything gets cut all the way down to the geometry or the size that we need. For the height, I want to make sure that it goes to the selected contour, but I also want to offset it a small amount. Oftentimes, if you go directly down to that edge, you might find that you leave a small remnants or the corner isn't quite sharp. So in this case, we're going to go down to -0.06. For the passes, there'll be no stock to leave. We're not doing multiple depths. We can repeat the finish pass if we want, but in this case, we're going to do a single finish pass, and we're going to say OK. The last thing that we need to check is we need to make sure that our 1/2" end mill can actually cut into these areas. You'll note that the diameter here is 0.394. This means that these corners are not getting removed. It's actually leaving material there, and unfortunately, that's not something that we want to do because those fillets, that geometry matches another part of the design. So I first want to drag this up, and I want to place it after that 2D adaptive to make sure that I'm minimizing my tool changes. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this. If I select duplicate, it automatically puts it directly after, so I don't need to worry about moving it. But now I can go in and make some modifications. I'm going to change this to use my 1/4" flat, and then in the geometry section, I'm going to use rest machining. In rest machining, I am going to say that the tool that came through here previously was a 1/2" tool. All the rest of the settings will be fine. We're only looking at finish passes. We're going down to the same depth. And now we're doing that finish cut with the 1/4". But notice that the 1/4" is going around the entire model. We want it to just focus on those fillets, the areas that were left behind. If we come back in and we modify our rest machining properties, if we make this radius larger than what we're working with in terms of our tool, you'll see that it does a full contour. However, if we make it smaller, take it all the way down to 0, and let the toolpath calculate, you can see that it's coming back and it's cutting the geometry that's left behind in those corners. So this is going to have a lot of rapid movements, but it's going to minimize the amount of time the tool is spent cutting, as the 1/2" tool can cut thicker, can cut all that material and cut it a lot quicker than the 1/4" bit could. Now that we have effectively gone from our 1/2" tool down to our 1/4" tool, let's move our way inward. The next thing that I want to do is I want to take that 2D contour toolpath with the 1/4" flat, and I want to start cutting different geometry. I want to finish off this as well as this inside section here, and I'm going to focus just on these first. The cut depth is going to be based on the contour. The passes are not going to contain any roughing passes, they're only going to be finishing passes, and then the linking parameters will leave as default. So we're going to allow it to come in and clean those out, and then come into this bottom one and clean it out. However, the bottom one never had a tool drop into it. So simply coming in and doing a finish contour in that area isn't quite going to work. In order to fix that, we need to come back in with a pocket toolpath or a 2D adaptive clearing toolpath. Using that same 1/4" end mill, we're going to allow it to do a 2D adaptive, leaving some material behind, but notice that it comes back and it tells us there's a warning. There's not enough material there, or there's not enough room there. If we review the warning, it tells us that it's an empty toolpath. If we do a little bit of investigation and we measure this, we can see that the diameter is 0.413, so there's plenty of room for the tool to get in there. However, if we look at some of the linking parameters, the linking parameters may be too big to allow the tool to get into those areas. So I'm going to make them a little bit smaller. I'm going to make them 0.02, and we're going to allow it to do the helical entry. If we come back, we can turn down the stock to leave. We can set this to 0.01, make it a little bit smaller, and see if it can actually get in there and clear that material out. It's still having problems with that, so another solution is to use a smaller tool or to keep manipulating those parameters. Using a smaller tool defeats the purpose. So the way that I want to approach this is to remove this adaptive clearing toolpath. So we're going to select it and go to delete. And then I'm going to use a 2D contour toolpath. I'm going to select the bottom edge, again using the 1/4" end mill. I'm not going to leave any stock behind because I'm going to use this as my final toolpath. But in the passes section, I want to make sure that I add a roughing pass. I want the tool to come in and clear out the material from the center. So we're going to start with one roughing pass. And in the linking section, we're going to allow it to ramp down. So we're going to allow it to use that contour and ramp its way down. We'll say OK and see if we can get this toolpath to generate. It does generate, however, it is met with some warnings. It's telling us that open passes are linked both ways using a zigzag ramp. And this is simply because it doesn't have enough room to go back and forth. That's an OK solution. We can always go back in and modify the passes, and we can set the type of cutting to go both ways. We're going to select the both ways option, and we'll say OK and allow it to regenerate. Because we told it that both ways was OK, it's the same toolpath, however, it's no longer having that warning for us. We're going to make sure that we carry this up because this is also our finishing toolpath, and then we modify this 2D contour and we change our selection. We want to remove this as a selection, but we do want the tool to come back in and cut the inside of all of these areas as well. And we're going to allow it to cut that as well. Allow it to regenerate, allow it to come back and clean all those out. I'm going to do one final operation inside of these holes, and I'm going to use the same parameters that I did for this 2D contour. I'm simply going to edit this operation, go back to my geometry, and select the inside edge of each of these. These are a little bit smaller, so oftentimes they'll produce some problems, but you can see we have that ramped entry. To minimize the amount of time spent, we can reduce the initial height of that contour, but you'll notice that this one does produce a warning. Lead out is dropped due to linking constraints, and that's okay because after the cut we can have it pull straight back out and the geometry will be okay. Again, another option is for us to use a smaller tool. We can pre-drill this so that the tool can just plunge straight down and work its way out. There are many different options and many different ways that we can get around this geometry. The last thing that we need to do is we need to drill and take care of these holes, but I think this is a great chance for us to save the file before we move on to our final step.